You're listening to the Cultivating Careers in Alternative Proteins podcast, a podcast which features students and early career professionals who work in the alternative protein industry, where they discuss their journeys and deliver advice on how you can start a career in this revolutionary field. Effective communication is key to the growth and development of any industry. One of the most common media platforms that many people consume information from these days is podcasts, which is one of the reasons why I started this podcast. I thought it would be fitting to have a guest who has a popular podcast on alternative proteins to share their experience on this podcast. I could think of no one better than Marina Schmidt to be this guest. Marina is a climate educator and founder of the impact media outlet Æ2Ğ MEDIA, an in-depth content studio specializing in agriculture and food sustainability. Her flagship podcast, Æ2Ğ, is ranked in the top 5% globally and has a loyal listenership in over 160 countries. It is obligatory onboarding material for new hires at several VCs and startups and is deemed excellent by MIT. In addition, Marina is also the voice and editor-in-chief of a new future food podcast funded by the Bavarian Ministry of Agriculture and Nutrition. With over 9 years of marketing and strategic communications experience, she serves on the jury for Impact Hub and as an advisor to future food scale-up Formo. In this episode, Marina shares how Æ2Ğ came to be, the exciting new branch of alternative protein products that Formo has created, and what integral futurism is. As she would say, let's dive right in. Thank you, Marina, for coming on the Cultivating Careers in Alternative Proteins podcast. It is so fantastic to have you on the show. I am honored to have a legend in the podcast space on here.
What a title. Wow, I am flattered.
Well, it's a very deserving title for all that you've done for the alternative protein industry, and I think a good place to start would be what people best know you for, which is the Æ2Ğ podcast. So what was the inciting action for starting it?
Well, it really depends on how far we want to go, AKA sitting on a therapist chair. It all started when I was born. But on a more serious note, actually, when I was 13, both my father and my sister got diagnosed with cancer. And it really made me question everything. It made me question how we eat, how we sleep, how we live our lives. And I started looking into nutrition science and food as medicine at a very young age. Like at the age of 14 and 15, I began cooking for my dad and cooking him lots of veggie-filled stews and curry with chickpeas and baking him cabbage and root vegetables. So food became something that I questioned a lot, and I have throughout the years probably tried 7, 8 different diets myself, all the different extremes from paleo and keto, which is crazy, right? To vegan, vegetarian, and anything in between. So throughout many years of working in various roles and communications in consulting, founding my own company, I realized, oh, actually, I should pick up again that passion for food and specifically that connection to food and sustainability. When I was observing the food tech space by now 4 years ago, I realized actually what's missing is some resource that structures content very clearly, that not just regurgitates news, but a source of information that's more educational. And the reason why I started the Æ2Ğ podcast was initially because that's exactly what I wanted to have for myself. I wanted to have something that goes deep into individual topics like biotech and food, cellular agriculture, the consumer acceptance of alt proteins, and not just in individual episodes, but in this case, in 12 episodes at a time, structured according to a supply chain or according to technologies or according to some other kind of framework. For some reason, it really, really hit a nerve. And even though I started it as something that I wanted to do on the side, it quickly became something that really started to consume most of my time. Even like 2 weeks after I started Red2Green, Food Labs, a Berlin-based VC, reached out to me to collaborate. And it has been escalating ever since.
Wow, that's pretty amazing. That was what led you to where you are now. And before you started the podcast, did you have any experience doing anything like this before?
Well, I've always been the kind of person that likes to jump into the cold water and learn how to swim right there, right then. I did have another podcast in German beforehand for my first company, which I founded 9 years ago, which is a company working with the German government to help academics get into their chosen career path. And back then, I was doing a podcast on team building and leadership, which actually went very well. I just had no idea how to measure what's good or bad in the podcast space, and like what is doing well in the podcast space. And though I think the most relevant experience that I have had and the most valuable experience actually came from a completely different field, which so often is the case, right? When I was working in consulting, I was working for Creative Doc, which is the largest corporate venture builder in the world, at least the largest independent one. And I would do consulting projects where we would be given the task, analyze the entire European consumer mobility market for business opportunities. I would lead the team. I would have 3 weeks and then just present in front of the board of a huge insurance company. And that kind of stress of looking at a field with fresh eyes, not knowing anything about the area beforehand and having to break it down. Okay, consumer mobility, you can break it down based on vehicles, based on the distance of transport options, based on certain consumer needs. There are so many ways that you can structure and create a framework for a certain topic area. Honestly, that's some of the most useful craft that I have gotten to learn. And because I transferred it to the podcast format, I think that has been the basis for why Red2Green has been one of the fewer podcasts in the space that actually has had strong partnerships, strong sponsoring with various companies in the space, as it's not just individual episodes, but it's more thought leadership. And I think we need to redefine how we see content, not in the medium, but in terms of what kind of quality, what kind of use case do you want to provide with the content you put out there. And the format can be adapted. It doesn't need to be like how everybody is doing it.
Yeah, and I really like the way that you structure the podcast with breaking it down into different seasons, and the seasons vary between each other on how they're individually structured. Sometimes it's more interview style, sometimes it's more of the, I'll say, narrative storytelling style. I could tell you've done a lot of research, but you also make sure that you do it in a very entertaining way that makes it enjoyable for any listener. I do think that your professionalism and passion really does get conveyed through the episodes.
Yeah. And I do really hope to relaunch Red2Green because there has been a time off, like 9 months or so. Just a lot of other things going on, and to relaunch it soon with a new format and a new level of professionalism and background planning behind it. Because that's the crazy thing. Like when you talk to any person that has made a podcast, they'll be like, oh my God, that is so much work. And then you talk to anybody who has never done a podcast, like, oh, it's just like you make an interview and you upload it. Yeah, you can do that. But I think by now there are enough formats that are like very low maintenance. And I think we are at the point where people really become picky with what they listen to. But anyway, this is not the alternative podcasting podcast. So you see, I get carried away.
Fair enough. No worries. I think it's just one of those things where it's maybe a little bit more difficult than some people may think it is.
As most things are, no?
Very true. I bet you've learned a lot through starting a podcast, and was wondering what ways do you feel that you've grown or developed professionally as a result?
Well, there is something different about learning and consuming information if you know that you have to teach it. And in general, for any kind of listener out there wanting to master a topic, I think a real hack is how can I consume information and educate myself, having planned already a way in which I will need to express that knowledge, whether it is in a presentation or in a podcast or in a series of LinkedIn posts, because then it moves from being a passive receiver to needing to translate and conceptualize all of this knowledge, piece it together, because we all know there's such a difference between recognizing something that you've heard before and being like, oh, yeah, I've heard that. I think I get what they're saying. And then being able to communicate yourself this knowledge and communicate in the language. And only once we're able to express what we have learned, I think we have gotten to true understanding. And using that and leveraging that has been an incredible gift over the years. So whenever somebody talks to me about plastic alternatives or food waste or consumer acceptance, it's like I immediately think in the frameworks that I have thought through when planning the content. And thinking in frameworks is sometimes so much easier or so much more rewarding because it helps you to add on knowledge better. It's like you get a piece of information and then you can put it onto the framework you already have. It doesn't just lay around scattered. Everything builds on each other.
Yeah, it's like seeing where everything all fits together to make that larger picture, just adding those little puzzle pieces up one at a time.
Yeah.
So you mentioned that you're thinking of starting up the Red to Green podcast again, but I know the Red to Green podcast is a part of the R2G Media. So how has that whole R2G Media evolved over time from the podcast to what it is today?
R2G Media is just a parent brand that holds all of the media and consulting projects. There's more than just the podcasting behind it. Of course, there's Red to Green, the English speaking podcast. I'm currently working on a German speaking podcast that will be called Blaues Brot, which, if you translate it, is blue bread. Looking at this tension between food and technology, bread and blue, right? And for that, it's a whole documentary audio series. So it's 20 episodes leading the listener through different points along the value chain, looking at how's the system set up, how could it look like in the ideal world, and how do we get there? It's a huge project funded by the Bavarian Ministry of Agriculture and Nutrition, as well as a German foundation called the Adalbert Raps Foundation. I've worked with them also on Red to Green. There are these two larger podcast projects. And the third pillar is some consulting work that I do, mostly connected to communications in alternative proteins.
So speaking of communication, I do know you have a communication related advisor role with Formo. Can you elaborate more on what you do there?
Formo is a Berlin-based fermentation company focused on precision fermentation and a new fermentation approach that we've been looking at how to communicate. I joined Formo as an advisor and consultant December 2023 with that big challenge. What is the best way to communicate this new category of products that are coming to market? Most people know Formo in the industry from their precision fermentation work. Formo is already on the market with what are called micro-fermentation products. So these are cheese alternatives, but they're neither plant-based nor are they animal-based. It's a new category using koji proteins. You have the microbes that are fed nutrients in a nutrient bath in a fermenter or bioreactor, however you would like to call it. Then the actual biomass is separated, like the microbes are separated, and your target ingredient, the protein, is left in the liquid, and that liquid is spray dried. From this spray dried liquid, you get koji protein. And koji is a fungal culture that has been used for centuries in Japanese cuisine, in miso, sake, soy sauce. So this white powdered protein, the koji protein, is very neutral in its taste. And this is the basis for cheese products. So Formo adds fats to it, and then you have something that is much closer to cheese than any kind of plant-based alternative right now out there.
Wow, that is quite fascinating.
Yeah, it is. And microfermentation just opens up a separate category, which just is important because it helps us to differentiate companies and approaches and avoid confusion.
Yeah, and I'm very excited to see how it evolves and grows, and maybe it has potential to be used for not just cheese, but other products as well.
Yeah. And I think there will be a wave of companies that start working in microfermentation because it just is very necessary in the alt protein space that we get to market faster while working on the moonshots.
Of course, yeah, makes sense. So I know you do a lot of work with Formo and Ã2Ğ Media, but I know on the side you also do other stuff to promote alternative proteins and a sustainable food system. So can you elaborate more on some of that work as well?
So there is another fun little monkey activity that I'm up to, which is using spoken word.
For those who may not know, what is spoken word?
Spoken word is a practice of using words with rhythm. So just imagine it as poetry that is meant to be performed. I think for a lot of people, poetry slams are more well known. Like if you've ever heard of a science slam or a poetry slam, you have a certain amount of time. In a poetry slam, you want things to rhyme or create a rhythm with the way that you're speaking. It doesn't have to be following completely poetic rules, but there's more of artistic expression. Like can be going more into the direction of rap or into a more poetic direction. So I've been thinking a lot about climate communication, and I was asked a couple of times to speak on that topic, and I was just like, I mean, yeah, but isn't there some way to communicate it in a more interesting manner? And I just decided to package my climate communication principles in a spoken word piece and use art images in the background to convey it. It's definitely more vulnerable to use a different kind of format and to put yourself out there. Yeah, and I'm giving the spoken word keynote tomorrow for the first time, trialing it at a small event in Lisbon, then next week, and then increasingly at larger events throughout the second half of the year. And I'm just really curious to see how it will land because how food relates to the normal human being. Food is not just proteins, it's not just carbohydrates, it's not just fats. Food is emotion and nostalgic memories from your childhood and your cultural background and your passions and your creative outlet and so many things to people. So I think there is something to bridge between how analytically we talk about the food ingredients. And so that's why I think it could sometimes be very good for us to merge these two worlds. And that goes through experience and art and everything that's a little bit more right brained and less rational. and more emotional.
Fair enough. Yeah, I think that's a really clever approach you're taking of using this spoken word media as a way of communicating the climate change issue. That's a great way of bringing it more down to earth and making it more on a human level.
Yeah, I think art sort of takes people's guard down a little bit.
Exactly. So another thing I know that you're also passionate about is integral futurism. Can you explain really what that means to someone who's maybe not familiar with that term?
So, integral futurism, it's a concept I'm working on slowly but surely. It stemmed from research in the history of the future of food. So, if you go into the 20th century, you can actually look at how we've perceived the future of our food to pan out. So, imagine in the 1920s, there were people writing about what happens if we're 7 billion. Like, how are we going to feed 7 billion? And they had their theories about what we need to do. And nowadays, we can look back at it and think, okay, how did that perception change over the course of history? Based on the historic literature, you can find three big types of futurists. And I will just skip the technical terms here, but some of them are very much proponents of technology, like the meal in the pill. And others believe that we can have enough food if we would share it. And the third big category are the ones that believe we need to reduce population. That's not a popular opinion and it didn't age well. But if you translate it into more grounded, more balanced views nowadays, it's about appreciating the resources that we have, understanding that resources are not limitless, they are finite, but that also just a question of how we appreciate the resources we have, how we deal with them, how we put them into circular systems instead of linear one use systems. And in integral futurism, this is the modern versions that I'm talking about here mainly. The fourth category that is sort of it's a bit absent in the historic literature is the ecological view, the belief that we would have enough if we work in line with nature, if we understand nature cycles, if we think about it more from a holistic ecosystem perspective instead of individual inputs, outputs, and short-term optimization, for example, of farm yields. You have these four thinkers next to each other in their modern version: pro technology, pro sharing and social solutions, pro efficiency and reducing resource use, and pro working with nature instead of against nature. And my argument is that people sometimes get stuck in one of them and believe that the others are not important. And we all have like our favorite baseline view that we hang on to. But integral means that every part of it is important to make the whole complete. Whenever somebody tells you we just need tech solutions, I would say, oof. And that's the thing, it's all important. It's all important. And we need to get to an understanding within the food industry where regenerative agriculture farmers can talk to alternative protein specialists and understand and appreciate each other. Many times we are working towards a similar outcome. We are just doing it through different perspectives in which we look at the food industry, and it's not helping to fight each other. It's important that we work with each other.
Right. You have to take a multifaceted approach to solving the problem.
Yeah.
I think that's a excellent philosophy to guide you on how one can solve large challenges such as climate change.
Mm. Yeah, we need a bit more Hakuna Matata within people who are trying to do something positive. We do need a little bit more coherence and understanding. It was really funny when I posted about this on LinkedIn. There's a guy who posted, yeah, We ecologists team up with the egalitarians, so the people who are more into the social aspect and sharing, and we are just the cool kids while the others are like clearly doing the wrong thing. And I'm like, no, that's exactly what I want to prevent, I like no, it's like somebody just went with a framework. Like now they have labels to categorize themselves into better groups. Damn it.
There's always unintended consequences.
Yeah. It's just, I just realized, okay, I just need to communicate more about it,
Well, I think you've done a fantastic job communicating everything from the podcast to your advisor role at Formo to your spoken word side passion.
Yeah, well, thank you, Jeffrey. You've been great at prepping and navigating the interviews.
Thank you. And last question, as this is a podcast about careers for alternative proteins, what advice do you have for job seekers in the alternative protein industry?
I think sometimes it's important to look at some of your actions as investments. Like you go into a conference and you pay a ticket, but it's an investment, it's not an expense. And I see that difference a lot. Like I was talking with a friend of mine who was an employee at Inform. At that time, I knew that he wanted to switch roles at some point. We talked about him going to a conference, and he was like, if it's not paid by Inform, I don't want to go to this event, because he saw it as an expense. But the number one advice that I can give is that when thinking about building your career, there are certain things that you may need to pay for, but it's not like they are not paid for. They will be paid for later down the line. In you building the important connections, meeting people over the course of years, like it's just this trust that if you show up and you talk to people and you come with a good intention, then things will come around. So my number one piece of advice is have a budget for your career development. And this is money that you do not treat like you would treat the money that you spent on a pizza on a night out. This is not your personal money. Just separate it mentally, have it in a different account or have it in a different folder within your bank, that it's clear this money can only be used for any kind of career development. It could be courses, it could be flights to conferences, it could be conference tickets, it could be whatever helps you at this stage of your career. It's important to treat it as an investment. Usually if you invest in ETFs, I don't know, you get like 8%, 12%, like over the course of many, many years. It's a low percentage overall. With investments in a conference, you may invest 300, 400 euros in a student ticket at a conference. You may end up having a job that gives you tens of thousands of euros. That's an investment return that's like unmatched in any kind of other setup.
You can't even put a value on that.
Yeah, you'll never know. Like it can be one connection at an event that made the difference. And then you're like, oh my God, my entire career would have been different if I wouldn't have met that one person.
Mm-hmm.
Definitely has happened to me many times.
I think it's a fantastic piece of advice that people don't often think about, is you really need to think about your future career as something that is really so important. As you mentioned, small changes like that can really lead to huge differences and you just don't know. So those investments are almost always worthwhile.
Yeah, just also getting a little bit out of the employee mindset. It helps to just see yourself as a product in a way, like just objectify yourself for a little bit. Can be good at times. See yourself as like, okay, I have a certain value proposition. How can I improve that value proposition? How can I go out there and build a career as like an entity? My father always used to say, you need to build your me Inc. And what does your me Inc. do? And Me Inc. has marketing expenses and it has human resource expenses, and that is super normal, you know?
All right, that's a good way to end it. Thank you again for coming on the show. It's been such a delightful conversation.
All the pleasure here. Thank you so much for spreading the information on alternative protein careers.
It is clear from Marina's experience that how you convey and communicate alternative proteins plays a vital role in furthering this industry. Even doing something like creating a podcast can be quite influential, which is yet another reason why there's a place for everyone, including you, to be a part of the alternative protein revolution. Pia Volz, the founder of Talist and a previous guest on this podcast, is giving a fireside chat where she'll be answering questions from attendees about careers in alternative proteins. This event takes place on September 17th at 7 p.m. Central European Time. I highly encourage you to attend. A link to register is provided in the show notes.